Well, as fighting continues in Ukraine following Russia's invasion on Thursday, international powers are taking action. The EU, the US, and their allies have agreed to cut off a number of Russian banks from the main international payment system, SWIFT. And that's not all. The assets of Russia's central bank will also be frozen, which will limit Russia's ability to access its overseas revenue. Now, these joint sanctions are the harshest measures to be imposed to date on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, but will they really be enough? That is the question. And joining us now is our international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman, and our economic analyst, Ariel Margalit. So how will the Russians actually be impacted by these economic sanctions? And I'm not just talking about the Kremlin itself, but your average Russian citizen.
Yeah, I think it depends which bank they're in. We're getting very mixed reports from Europe, and I think the jargon that we've all been using is some banks are under sanctions, and we're talking about SWIFT users in Russia. We're talking about 291 users. The amount altogether to around 800 billion US dollars per year in transactions. That's around half of the wealth of the Russian economy per year. So it's around 1.5 trillion US dollars. It is going to harm some of the population, but the idea is not to harm the population. The idea is to harm Putin, the government, and some of the oligarchs that are keeping him in power.
Oh, and I mean, Russia's economy is worth $1.5 trillion. It is the 11th biggest economy in the world. Will Russia be able to withstand these sanctions? Will they actually have an impact? What's going to happen here? Will they be effective?
Yeah, two big points, Natasha. Number one, how effective is the SWIFT sanction going to be, or these sanctions in general? There's a lot of question marks. There are a lot of question marks surrounding this. Some analysts say at the end of the day, despite the relative decline of the United States, the US dollar and the SWIFT system is still too central to the world financial system, that the Russian banks are going to be really hurt hard by the fact that they can't use it. On the other hand, there are those who say, but wait, there are the Chinese, the Indians are setting up an alternative system. The Russians have had years to get ready to deal with this. They have strong foreign currency reserves to withstand a fall in the ruble. They'll be able to handle these financial sanctions. Obviously, there's a lot of unknown about this. This is uncharted territory. The SWIFT sanction has only been used once, and that was against Iran, an economy a lot smaller than Russia's and maybe less globalized, so there are a lot of questions. The second point, more important than the SWIFT sanctions, if you really think about it, and you listen to the experts, are the sanctions on the individual oligarchs, the yachts, the apartments, the properties, the bank accounts. How effective are the sanctions going to be against them personally? Obviously, those sanctions have been issued in some cases, but it's one thing to proclaim the sanction. It's another thing to actually implement it. These are people with a lot of money who can hire some really smart people to help them, and I think are going to try to put up a lot of obstacles.
And we also know that there are many Russian billionaires and oligarchs who aren't being touched whatsoever. But I guess my question is, why is the West reluctant to hit Russia with the full range of economic sanctions that are out there right now? And if we're not going to see any type of boots on the ground approach from NATO, from the West, is anything really going to change here?
When you have a pipe, there's two sides at the ends. Yeah. It's not just one-ended. And cutting off, for example, Russia from the purchases from Europe of Russian oil and gas also means a lack of supply in Europe that's already battling after 2 years of pandemic with supply chain difficulties that we've spoken about many times here. The lorries, the whatnot, truck drivers are protesting. There are attempts to use other resources. For example, we're already seeing shares of companies that are indulging in natural gas, especially in the Mediterranean, for example. We're seeing some shares of those companies going up in the stock market today in Tel Aviv. It's one alternative, but we're talking about so much that is being imported from Russia into Europe, on a yearly basis, that it's very hard to find an alternative in such a short period of time. That's why they're also keeping the pipes open. Just one more thing to follow up on what Owen said. It's true, we're putting a lot of attention on American sanctions and EU sanctions, obviously asking the question where Israel stands in this equation. But there's also an Eastern bloc.
We're going to get to that, so
and
I don't want to touch that
yet. And he mentioned India and China. There's so many pipes in place, and there's so many ways around this these restrictions that the West is putting on some SWIFT accounts that Russia can definitely find its way around. It's not going to strangle its economy to death, but it is going to make it more difficult for many of the oligarchs that are hopefully going to put pressure on Putin to withdraw.
All right, so we're going to be talking about China shortly, but I just want to turn to Ukraine. Nearly 120,000 Ukrainians have fled the country at this point. Probably more, and the United Nations fears that 4 million could do so if the situation deteriorates any further. So those who are leaving the country are mostly women, they're children, they're the elderly, since men of military age, which is 18 to 60, according to the Ukrainian president, are banned from leaving. And nations like Poland, Hungary, they're opening their doors for Ukrainian refugees. But the question is, how long is this goodwill really going to last? And that is what I want to ask you guys. It's interesting because we didn't see such an unconditional, I guess you could say, welcome to those fleeing conflicts in the Middle East, in Africa. Why is that different in this case, and what does that mean for the region? Owen?
Well, two reasons, Natasha. The obvious reason that these people are Europeans, right? So there's going to be a different reaction just viscerally among the publics in these countries, certainly in a country like Poland, right, which has had a very particular stance on immigration, among other countries that have had those kinds of stances, to Europeans coming across their border versus Middle Easterners or others from other parts of the world. That's number one. Number two, obviously, the politics. There's such a huge amount of sympathy for obvious reasons with the Ukrainian cause in a country like Poland, in other countries that border Ukraine and Eastern Europe, that they're going to be willing to absorb these refugees simply as part of the effort of standing up and with Ukraine because of the obvious sensitivities to them about what Russia is doing. But obviously, you're absolutely right. There still is an open question. It's one thing when the numbers are 120,000 people and the operation has been going, the war has been going on for 3 or 4 days. What happens when it's actually 4 million people, according to that estimate? Are people still going to feel the same way? It is an open question, and it will be interesting to see if and when we get there how these countries are going to react.
Right. I mean, ultimately, we also need to understand what's going to happen to Ukraine itself. If you have this massive immigration, what does that mean for the local economy if Russia is, in fact, taking it over? I mean, do you have any expectation? What do you think could happen, economically as well?
First of all, as Owen mentioned, the memory of 1939 is very much alive in Poland, and there is very much in the whole of Europe an understanding that we haven't seen something like this since World War II in this scale, an invasion of a country of this scale, and none of these countries to the west of Ukraine want Vladimir Putin to sit on their border. That's also part of it. The more he advances, the more they are also at risk of potentially being the next in his rampage. We don't know when and if he will stop. With regards to the economy, we do have to bear in mind this is probably not going to be an extensively long war. After the war, there's usually a boom of construction.